There's a town in the hills of Kentucky that never wanted to be found. You won't see it on any travel map, and if you ask the locals about it, most will look away before answering. The air there feels heavy, not because of the cold dust or the fog that rolls down from the mountains, but because of something older. Something in the blood. They say it runs thicker than water, darker than sin. Before we go deeper into this dark story, make sure to subscribe to American Shadow, the place where real American crime stories come to life. Hit the like button if you're hooked, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think about this case. The story begins deep in Appalachia, a place where generations grew up under the same roofs, where families married into each other's names until the family tree stopped branching. Outsiders whispered about them for decades, calling it the town that forgot the rest of the world. But what happened there wasn't just isolation. It was something far more disturbing. When the first settlers came to those hills, they were escaping persecution, poverty, and shame. They built their homes with their own hands, raised their children on the land, and swore loyalty to one another above all else. That oath, over time, became a curse. It sealed their fate, binding their future to the very bloodlines they'd once sworn to protect. Locals tell stories about the blue people of Kentucky, families whose skin carried a strange tint, whose eyes seemed clouded by something unnatural. Doctors blamed genetics. Historians blamed isolation. But the truth is far more human and far more haunting. These weren't monsters. They were people, trapped by loyalty, secrecy, and the cruel geography of the mountains that held them hostage. Children were born into homes where everyone shared a last name. Weddings took place in the same barns where funerals had been held generations earlier. And behind every locked door was a truth no one dared to say out loud. Those who tried to leave never made it far. If you listen closely to the hills, they still whisper their names. The ones who stayed, the ones who didn't survive, and the ones whose stories were buried so deep, even the state forgot them. This is the story of America's most inbred town. But it's also a story about what happens when loyalty and blood mix together until no one remembers where one ends and the other begins. The town was called Hazard County once, but what lay deep within its hollers wasn't part of any official map. They called it Briar Hollow, though no one's quite sure if that name came from the thick brush that surrounded it, or the way it seemed to cut anyone who got too close. Outsiders rarely entered. Those who did often left with stories that sounded like nightmares told around a fire. Stories about faces that looked too familiar, families that spoke in half-whispered words, and the haunting stillness that followed them through the woods. The people of Briar Hollow lived apart for more than a century. Roads didn't reach them, and electricity came decades later than the rest of Kentucky. But they didn't seem to mind. To them, the outside world was dangerous, filled with greed, betrayal, and ridicule. Inside the hollow, they said, they were safe. They had everything they needed: land, livestock, and one another. But one another soon became too close for comfort. Generations of isolation led to marriages between cousins, then siblings, and eventually unions so close that even the town's preacher turned his eyes away. Birth defects became common. Some children were born with twisted limbs, others with faces that didn't quite seem right. A few never spoke at all, and yet they were loved, fiercely, protected by a code of silence that outsiders could never understand. One doctor who visited the region in the 1950s called it biological time capsule. He said it was like looking back at evolution gone astray. But what he didn't see, what no outsider saw, was the reason it happened. It wasn't just isolation. It was pride. These families believed that their blood was sacred, untainted by the corruption of the outside world. They believed they were preserving something pure. But in truth, they were burying themselves alive. The oldest woman in the hollow once said, "We don't marry strangers, we marry our own, because no one else can understand us." Her words were simple, but behind them was a tragedy centuries in the making. The town didn't die because of disease or poverty. It died because it refused to let new blood in. And when the last generation came of age, they realized too late that the curse was already written in their veins. By the 1970s, the hollow was a ghost of itself. The timber companies had cut through the nearby hills, opening paths that had once been hidden. That's when outsiders began to appear again. Journalists, doctors, and curious travelers chasing rumors of a forgotten bloodline. What they found was both heartbreaking and horrifying. There were families living in collapsing shacks, roofs caved in, floors covered in dust and coal ash. The few surviving residents were mostly elderly or malformed from birth. Some had speech so slurred it was nearly unintelligible. Others sat silently for hours, their pale eyes fixed on the forest. But when asked their names, they always gave one of three, because after 100 years, there were only 3 families left, each connected to the others by blood. One photographer who visited in 1976 wrote that the silence of the place felt alive. He said he could hear his own heartbeat louder than the birds. When he tried to take a picture of an old man sitting on a porch, the man stared at him with something like recognition, like he'd seen him before, though they had never met. Later, when the photos were developed, the man's eyes reflected light in a way that made them appear almost white. The photographer never went back. State health officials eventually came, offering medical help, welfare checks, and relocation. But the families refused. They didn't trust government men, didn't trust hospitals, and certainly didn't want strangers poking at their blood. One woman reportedly told a nurse, "God made us this way. Ain't nothing you can fix." What outsiders couldn't grasp was that Briar Hollow wasn't just a place, it was a closed system. Every birth, every marriage, every death was part of a cycle that had repeated for generations. It was self-sustaining until it wasn't, and as the 20th century marched forward, time seemed to forget the hollow entirely. The children grew up, had fewer children of their own, and then, one day, stopped having any at all. The bloodline was thinning not by choice but by consequence. Nature was closing the book on a story humanity never should have written. But before the hollow faded from the map, one final event would draw the eyes of America upon it. A discovery so unsettling, it made the rest of the country finally ask the question, how could something like this exist in the heart of modern America? It started with a simple emergency call in the spring of 1983. A young man, barely 20, had wandered out of the woods barefoot, covered in mud and blood. He'd been walking for miles before someone in a nearby town saw him and called for help. When the sheriff arrived, the boy didn't speak. He only repeated one word, "Mama." At first, they thought he was a runaway, maybe a victim of abuse. But when the hospital ran basic tests, something didn't add up. His blood type was abnormal, his cognitive responses inconsistent. His last name matched no one in county records. When they asked where he lived, he simply pointed east, toward the dark stretch of mountains that locals called the Line. That's when the sheriff realized he'd come from the hollow. Officials went in 2 days later, accompanied by social workers and a state medical examiner. What they found inside the valley would make national headlines. Half a dozen collapsed homes, livestock bones piled behind sheds, and a graveyard with more unmarked stones than named ones. There were still people living there, but they didn't come out. They watched from doorways, pale faces half hidden behind curtains, eyes wide and unblinking. The team discovered the young man's family, or what was left of it. His mother was bedridden, frail and silent, her body twisted from years of sickness. But DNA testing later revealed she wasn't just his mother. She was also his sister. His father had died years before, buried in a hand-dug grave beside the house. The bloodline had folded in on itself completely. The news broke in waves, first local, then national. Headlines called it the Lost Town of Kentucky, the Hollow of Blood, America's Hidden Family. But the coverage missed the heart of the story. It wasn't about deformity or disease. It was about human isolation pushed to its breaking point, about a group of people who had once been proud, then shamed, then forgotten, and by the time anyone cared enough to look, it was already too late. Reporters descended on the area, taking photos, asking questions, and framing the residents as sideshow curiosities. The locals hated it. For them, the hollow was never a spectacle. It was home. But the damage was done. By winter, the remaining families had scattered, their shacks left to rot beneath the trees. And yet, even as the last residents disappeared, the hollow didn't die. The land itself seemed to remember. Travelers say if you walk the old trails today, you can still hear children laughing in the fog, or catch a glimpse of a figure watching from the tree line, someone with eyes too light to belong to the living. After the hollow was abandoned, the state fenced off the main road, claiming it was for safety reasons. But anyone who lived nearby knew better. They'd seen the way animals avoided that part of the forest. They'd heard the strange echoes at night. Sounds like voices carried by the wind, calling names that no one alive still bore. The hollow had been sealed, yes, but it hadn't been forgotten. Not by the land, not by the blood. In the years that followed, researchers and amateur historians tried to piece together the truth. They studied birth records, medical files, and the faded photographs that journalists left behind. What they found painted a chilling picture, not of monsters, but of what happens when a community turns inward for too long. Inbreeding wasn't the story's cause, it was the symptom. The real disease was isolation. Generation after generation, fear had replaced faith, pride had replaced mercy, and the family tree that once reached for the heavens had slowly strangled itself. One geneticist described the hollow as a living echo chamber of ancestry. Every mutation, every flaw, every inherited pain compounded, generation after generation. But what she didn't mention, what none of the reports could explain, was the lingering presence that so many visitors described. A feeling like being watched. A low hum in the air, as if the earth itself was breathing. The few who dared enter after dark claimed to see faint blue glows between the trees. Some said it was swamp gas, others said it was something older. The remnants of those who couldn't leave. Maybe it was guilt, maybe memory, maybe something that science couldn't quite measure. And here's where most people turn away. Because once you understand what happened in that hollow, you begin to question your own blood. How much of who we are is choice, and how much is inheritance? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you stay, protect your family, and carry on the curse? Or would you walk away, leaving behind everything you've ever known? Because the truth is, the hollow isn't just a place, it's a warning. A mirror held up to every forgotten corner of America. And maybe to something inside us all. Decades passed, the hollow sank deeper into silence, swallowed by the same hills that once gave it life. Trees grew through the foundations of houses, rust claimed the old water pumps, graves vanished beneath moss and fallen leaves. And yet, even as the wilderness reclaimed it, stories continued to leak out, passed down through whispers, shared in hushed tones at bars and church steps across Kentucky. Some said a few descendants survived, scattered across the state, living quiet lives under new names. Others believed they never truly left, that the hollow still breathes beneath the soil, its bloodline dormant, but alive, waiting. One local folklore researcher claimed she received a letter in the mail, written in shaky handwriting with no return address. Inside was a single sentence. You think we died, but we remember you. But what truly haunts the hollow isn't the people who live there. It's the silence that followed them. Because silence has weight. It holds guilt, sorrow, memory. And that silence has hung over eastern Kentucky like a fog that never lifts. You can still find remnants if you know where to look. A rusted school bell half buried by vines. A child's shoe found miles from any road. A Bible, water damaged and bloated, its family names written in the same handwriting over 100 years apart. Line after line, the same surnames looping endlessly, as though time itself refused to move forward. Every so often, thrill seekers make the trip, armed with flashlights and cameras. Most come back with nothing but stories of eerie sounds, strange lights or shadows flickering at the edge of vision. But one group, recording for an online documentary in 2011, claimed they found something far worse. A small wooden cabin still standing. Inside a single chair, a rusted bed frame, and on the wall dozens of handprints, small, childlike, pressed into the wood as if trying to get out. They left before sunset, their footage shaky, voices trembling. When asked later why they didn't stay longer, one of them said, "It didn't feel empty. It felt like something was waiting for us to leave." Maybe the hollow never really vanished. Maybe it just changed its shape, waiting in the quiet corners of history, beneath our curiosity, behind our own reflection. Because sometimes, the darkest parts of America aren't the places you can find. They're the ones that find you. Somewhere in the archives of the Kentucky Historical Society, there's a folder marked only with a number, no title, no description. Inside are faded photographs, yellowed birth certificates, and a family tree that folds in on itself like a snake devouring its own tail. It's all that remains of Briar Hollow, a place that the state quietly erased, but history refused to forget. The photographs are the hardest to look at. You can see their faces, ordinary, yet not. Eyes too light, skin too pale, smiles that never quite reach their cheeks. There's a sadness in them, a kind of resignation. They weren't monsters. They were victims of a trap their ancestors built out of fear, out of shame, out of a desperate need to belong to something. The cruelest truth is that they didn't choose this. They were born into it. And in that way, their story isn't so different from ours. Every family has shadows. Every bloodline carries secrets we'd rather not face. The hollow just lived theirs out loud, etched into bone and history, impossible to ignore. Their tragedy isn't that they were different, it's that they were forgotten. Sometimes I wonder if that's why the hollow still lingers. Maybe it isn't haunted by ghosts, but by memory itself, by the need to be remembered, even in shame. Maybe every whisper through those trees is a reminder that when you bury the past deep enough, it doesn't die, it waits. And so the story ends where it began, in the dark hills of Kentucky, where the wind hums through the trees and the ground remembers every footprint it's ever held. The hollow has no living descendants, no monuments, no graves with names. But its legacy runs deeper than any graveyard. It's a wound carved into the American story, a warning written in blood, isolation, and silence. If you ever find yourself driving through the backroads of Appalachia and see a road with no name, one that twists and disappears into the trees, don't follow it. Some places are forgotten for a reason. Some stories were never meant to be found. because the hollow may be gone, but its blood still whispers beneath the soil. And if you listen closely enough, you might just hear it calling you home.